Good morning, and thanks to all of you. First of all, we would like to congratulate Rooted for its 10th anniversary and the celebration of this sort of benchmark event in our sector. Having said that, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about social networks, but above all, we're going to talk about the capabilities that were given by the analysis of social networks. We're going to try to see how this applies in the real world, and then we will try to see, with some examples, whether it works live with things that can be done. I need to move on to the next slide. A quick presentation or introduction. I'm sure some of you here know me already, but for the rest, I started in cybersecurity in 2001. Together with other partners, I set up the company, and we follow there. And we also have with us Carlos, who is responsible of the cyber intelligence area, and he is an expert in the list, and he's going to contribute a lot. So what are we going to talk about? I think it is vital to discuss the concepts we're going to explain, to give a bit of context of what we're going to be talking about, because there are some myths or things that are often misinterpreted, and we want to define very briefly sort of the general picture. First of all, when we talk about social networks, if we ask any of us, what is a social network? The first thing that will come to mind would be Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. These platforms of massive use, but really, these are social networks. And those of us who are of a certain age are clear about this. Social networks are human interactions. It's what the people you went out to have a bite or go to the movies or play with, your friends. These are social networks that then persisted throughout time. But unfortunately, any teenager now interpret social networks as like this. What we tend to see is this, and this is not just teenagers, but these are very common pictures at restaurants or anywhere else. And what is the problem? Sorry, I need a bit of water. The problem is that the best friends nowadays are those that you haven't even met. And that is a problem that somebody can benefit from in the following way. Having got here, as Vicente has said, we can make a difference between, well, first of all, thanks to Vicente for bringing me and the organization for inviting us. So we can see that on the one hand we have social networks in the physical and the virtual level, and they overlap at some point, and on the other hand we have social media, which as we shall see, yes, and in fact it is one of the things that I was saying at the beginning. If you use, you may use interchangeably social media and social networks when actually they have very different context. What is social media and what are social networks? When we talk about social media, we're talking about online communication platforms. In the case of Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all of these, but also not just the platforms, but also the content. In the case of social networks, we're talking about relationships, we're talking about contact, who publishes what, who relates with whom, who says what, and for how long, and what's the degree or the frequency of contact. And in fact, one of the key factors of social networks is the influence power. And we will discuss that later on with Carlos, which are what is the intention that somebody may have to manipulate the environment of a user. Like this user, we have here a group of friends, and we want to know which specific user to work on. This picture is also very interesting because through social networks we look for approval. We look for friends, and that is great, but on the other hand, somebody can benefit and use that for their own benefit. What's interesting for us when we analyze social networks is to get to know the environment and the context. If we want to approach a goal, and we don't go straight to that person, but we probably approach first a friend or a family member, etc. In fact, we have the perception is very different. What we believe people see from us and from what they really see. We believe that we look just great, and it can be completely different. In fact, it's very much connected with ego and egoism and the desire to be the best, the most popular. We believe that anything that we publish, everybody is just expecting to see what we see and how we react, and that is a problem because we've discussed it already, that people may actually just want to use that information, that situation, to use it as an approach technique. For instance, I set up a profile. If I want to have an influence on Carlos, I can set up a profile where I express ideas completely different from the ones he has. And you can say that's counterproductive, but with this profile, by showing this, but I can actually have two profiles, one where I express the complete opposite to what he says, and another one where I approach his ideas and his discourse. And when I have those two users, I can play with both to obtain his trust. Yes, it's one of the techniques that Vicente, when we want to reach a goal or we want to approach somebody, at some point probably you will have found that for no reason, a social network, you may receive an attack or negative comments that you don't even know. And very often that happens because if I am A and I want to approach B and I don't know how to do it, because depending on the capacities of time, you will use different techniques. And one possibility is to set up different profiles to approach him. And out of the 3 profiles I have, 2 I'm going to use to attack him in social networks. I'm going to criticize him, and when he tries to defend himself, or unless he is the typical guy who blocks the people away, I can appear defending him, and therefore we set up a link, and then in a private conversation he can perhaps thank me for defending him, etc. And this looks like it's very artificial, but it actually happens quite often. So very careful with those who we believe are our friends, because they may actually want to do something against us to their advantage. Okay, some statistics. There are over 4 billion users in internet, and more than 80% are active users of social networks. So There are many users connected and many users that use social networks. But not only we use social networks, but we use them in a massive way. Another very important figure, out of the 10 websites that are used more often, except for Google, Chapter, the Russian search engine, we find Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. These are just social networks, so there's really a lot of interest. We spend pretty much all day long in porn videos. Don't skip it. It's also, yes, pornography is also there between the top 10 products. But what happens? Social networks have become like the place for confession, where we express our sorrows and our joys. But as we've said earlier on the one hand, we want somebody to listen to us, but we don't know who is out there listening to us, and they may actually use that moment of weakness, because probably when we are expressing joy, this is probably done publicly, but when we are dealing with our sorrows, we probably do that in a more intimate environment. Perhaps we are at home, and in that type of environment we do not see any danger, and therefore we can express ourselves sort of more frankly, more sincerely, and say things that we wouldn't say in public. But that message can get anywhere, and people can use it against us. And of course, we're always striving for the likes. This is an example that I think shows very well the use that we make of social networks. In the case of Twitter, this is an example of a terrorist attack in Strasbourg, and somebody says, I'm in the middle of a shooting in the center of Strasbourg, and I am in the cellar of a restaurant. So you're in the middle of a terrorist attack, and you mention this in Twitter. You not only mention that you're there. You could just say I'm okay, but you're saying I am with 50 people. If you want to do even more damage, come here. I remember similar messages in the case of the Paris terrorist attack in November 2015, where they actually said, I remember at the time, I was monitoring social networks, and there were users that were saying, we're hiding in this street, number 11, and we are with so-and-so. So you have to think social networks are okay to communicate, to socialize, but you should actually be careful with what you say, because yes, in this particular case, these are extremes, but it's particularly relevant how we use social networks to disseminate any type of contact. In this case, he is after the like just by mentioning that he is in the middle of the shooting of the terrorist attack. So social networks have a good side and a bad side, and the bad side can be used by the good guys and the bad guys. So after this short introduction, we're going to introduce or intersperse some demos. So, having established the difference between social network and social media, of course, we're talking about social networks and virtual social networks, and it's not the same. Social network is much wider than just virtual social networks, and now we're going to talk about non-virtual social networks. When we talk about social networks, everybody does that study. Politicians, companies, good guys, bad guys, because you can get plenty of information. And if that information, as we shall see now, you overlap it with the information we publish, it can be very interesting. When we do a social network analysis of a structure, the first thing we have to do is to know which type of structure we're facing, first of all, to know whether we know this is a formal or informal structure, and we will see how they're different. Because when we do this type of analysis, what we're after is to get to know how it is and then see what's the goal or who are we going to investigate or research. There are many types of networks. You can see a bunch of examples here. So we have to, but what's crucial is the difference between formal and informal. Let's see an example. This is a formal structure. Within this structure, this could be a company, or it can be an organization such as of whatever network type. If we decide for whatever reason that we want to approach Vicente because we think he's a relevant position in that organization and we want to acquire relevant data, if I wanted to think who can I approach because I have time and I don't want to go straight away to him, I would guess it would make sense to approach somebody in the board of directors because they would seem to be closer to them, so it might be easier to approach one of them before tackling Vicente. This would be a formal structure. But if we move on to the informal structure, this is the same hierarchical structure of the company. What is the informal structure like? Because in parallel to the formal structure, we also have an informal structure that will be due to friendships and interpersonal relationships within the company or any organization. So we can see that Vicente is here, and we should think that he should be at the center, but no, he is sort of at the border. He's at the sort of outside. And if we think who should we approach to then get access to Vicente, well, we see that we had to approach Arsenio. And who is Arsenio? Arsenio is right there at the bottom. So initially we wouldn't have considered him as a way to approach Vicente. So if you don't do the informal analysis of the relationship as well as the formal one and overlapping information from the social networks, this type of approach wouldn't have worked. So an example of this type of approach to profiles we can also find in a very classic example, which is the fraud of the CEO. First of all, you have to know which is the formal structure of the structure, and on the other hand, you have to study the informal structure and get information from social networks to know at a point in time when the gentleman who's going to make the payment order is going to be out of reach because they're traveling or whatever, and then you can replace them and make the payment request. This would be like what's happened in the Ministry of Defense. I guess you're all familiar with the crisis that has been reported in the media because of the intrusion of the Ministry of Defense network, and this would be the case because it's, from what I've read in the papers, it would seem that it had been done through phishing, through some low-level user or with a profile that's quite low-level, and probably what they did was to analyze the formal and informal structure to know that that was the chosen user, the one with which they would have more probability of success. So that could be an example. Yes, it was. If it was a targeted attack, then it was a good strategy. So we find the space, which are the virtual networks, and then the social networks, and in the overlapping, the social media analysis and the social networks, the overlapping surface is very important to get information that once we process gives us very valuable intelligence. And why? Because we are social animals. We like to socialize and share, have friends, think that we have influence in the networks, and that makes us very easily very easy to manipulate. If we get together the ego we had with the likes and the information that we publish, we are really very probable victims. We have because we have these physical and virtual networks that overlap, and that generates a lot of very relevant information. Going back to what I had said at the beginning, it would seem that what doesn't happen in social media doesn't happen. It's like the prior presentation that was very interesting and very dynamic, and we've seen it, and most of us had seen most of the films and could very well identify with the comments, but there was one journalist, and in this case, journalists use a lot social networks because often the witnesses are users themselves that provide that information. Well, intelligence in social media will be based in that on published content, and we will see the different types of public content that is published and how it can be used, and on the other hand, the relationship between these people that are producing this content. We will talk about virtual communities and how there could be a shared interest between different users and how that can be detected and used in the future. So very quickly, what happens in 60 seconds in internet, in social media? What happens is everything that you see here in the slide. Over 1 million logins to Facebook, 90,000 publications in Twitter. So huge amount of information. We're very active. Over 80% of users are active users of social networks, and we are very active, and we not only use them, but we use them a lot. And what's the content? What is the content that's interesting to analyze? Well, there's everything really. Because sometimes when we think, if we ask what type of information do you believe that can be relevant for research or for an investigation, many of you will talk about what's here. The text that is published, for instance, in Twitter, that message published, the picture in Instagram, the video, an audio file, these sort of things. But there is information that we do not control, where we depend from a third party, for instance, from the type of information that we use to publish a tweet. We cannot remove that. And people can know whether we're using iPhone, Android, BlackBerry, iPad, and then there is information about the date, the time, our user ID. There is a lot of information, and everything is relevant, everything is of interest for an investigation or a research. So do not think only about what you say, but when we say it, to whom we say it. All of that information is useful when we're doing analysis. So we're going to try to make the first of the demos. Carlos and I like risk. Going to the borders, to the limit. So we're going to do it live, and what we're going to do is connected to what has come out in the previous presentation. There's been a comment about the fact that somebody devoted time to identify which players appeared in what film, and these are things that can now be done automatically. One example, this is particularly because what Vicente is going to show right now is useful, because when you try to identify virtual communities that we want to analyze, we will not only use what they say or who says it, but also which device they use and how they use it and what they say within that medium. And one person perhaps can vary the way in which they talk depending on the network they're using. So it can be relevant how many people are behind a digital identity or a Twitter account. All of that is of interest. So this is a brief explanation that we have developed specifically for this conference. And what we're going to do, I have different videos and we're going to do tests and see if this works. We're going to upload this video. This is a program, perhaps many of you won't know it, because it's a TV3 program, it's a new program. It started recently and I've been fortunate to be able to collaborate in that program, and let's see what we can do in an automatic way. On the one hand, I've uploaded the video, and what we're going to do, imagine we are a company where we want to check on the brand of our company, and we want to know what content is being published on a social network, sort of online, or real time. So we'll do a search of a number of words that appear or may appear in a video. So we are recovering many videos and we want to do a search, and in this case we will include words that we know are going to appear, but the approach is that you can monitor any type of network of content where we want to check whether there's a reference to our brand or somebody appears that can be of interest for our research, be it to act proactively or just to increase our knowledge about a brand. So we have captured many videos and we want to search. In this case we'll be doing a search with the name of one person and expressions that may or may not come up.
Em preocupa molt sempre la seguretat i per tant a mi m'agradaria creuar per davant d'un autobús per veure si efectivament para.
Ja, hopla!
Y en el momento que aparezca se ha cortado. Estos son el caso de la demo, si no falla, parecería que no.
This is just a move, so you can really tell that this is a demo. Otherwise, so we want to detect which terms or names of people that may come up in a multimedia content, and in this case we're using a video, and you will see how it can detect how these terms come up in that video, in that content. So now it is analyzing the video and using artificial intelligence to interpret what's being said in the video, and as soon as the content that we're after, it should let us know. Yesterday night it was working. We are here connecting with our own server, so the connection is not the right one, it's not the real environment, and that's why it's going quite slow. So now when it's done, we'll see what happens. We've tried to look for examples with different moments of the video that I thought were relevant. On the one hand, the first word,
paso al siguiente vídeo, a ver si hay más suerte en el siguiente.
Maybe.
Esa realmente es que
Maybe I have to move on to the next video and see if we're luckier.
si no después vuelvo a
There.
esto, vamos a probar con otro, a ver si
So we're going to try with another one. In this
este
case,
era un vídeo de un programa, en este
this was the video of a program, and the second video is a real.
Muchas de vuestras
Case.
detenciones fueron en contra de musulmanes
Many
inocentes
of the
y que no formaban ninguna
detentions
amenaza.
or the people who were
yihadista.
Vuestra represión en contra de nuestras hermanas ha tenido un precio caro
many of the
con el permiso
arrests
del Todopoderoso.
were against some of our people who were not at all had done nothing. So there are some very violent scenes here.
Estos son los vídeos, digamos,
These are the original videos that were uncensored. Okay.
pero vamos a ver si hay más suerte aquí en este caso. Vamos a buscar. Imaginemos que somos miembros de fuerzas poco de seguridad, pues saber.
So we are part of the security forces, and we want to see if there's a reference to the Spanish security forces, the Guardia Civil, or to specific people.
Vamos a ver. Estamos buscando en este caso.
In this case,
Zoido, porque aparecía
we're looking for Zoido,
Más esto es relevante porque
because there was a reference to him in a tweet, and this is important because this was a video that had been put together with different terrorist attacks in different cities, and in Barcelona was very prominent, and there was the video was most of it in Spanish, and there was this seemed to have quite a lot of knowledge about the location, because of the Twitter messages that had been published in Spanish and because of references to specific people.
The interesting bit here in this approach is that you're able, without needing to watch all that content, because we're just saying that here some people are beheaded and there are some really gory scenes. So the analyst shouldn't need to see these contents. It should just be some kind of whistleblower, or you can set the people you want to monitor or control, if you want to know. If you want to see some exact words or mentions, Zoido, Guardia Civil, Barcelona or Spain, that you get a warning to locate the main diffusion source, to do an investigation, and to block on social media if that is being disseminated. And the civil guard, for example, they were looking for the parts where the civil guard is mentioned, as well as Zoido, Barcelona, but we could detect that automatically without needing to play the video. And this is quite interesting. As we were saying at the beginning, if we assess a network, but at a certain point, as could have happened in the case of Vicente Aguilera, you're investigating on a target that is good for you, that in fact is not good, and you need to research another one. If they're monitoring that whole network, even though they're not focused on the second objective,
Preocupa molt sempre és la seguretat. I per tant, a mi m'agradaria creuar per davant d'un autobús per veure si efectivament para.
Ja, hopla!
Ai, Déu, aviam.
Esto somos capaces de identificarlo, por ejemplo, o aquí en este...
Sí, m'estàs dient que posaràs aquí una aplicació infantil i que d'aquesta aplicació infantil tu sabràs dades meves?
Correcte.
Have you a boyfriend?
Is this how you usually talk to a girl when you first met her?
Imaginemos que, no sé, pues en el caso de un alguien que estuviera hablando mal.
well, as you can see on the video, if someone was talking badly about a brand, there may be a TV channel that is being reproduced and may identify that they're watching a certain TV channel in particular.
Bueno, pues aquí en este caso, pues por ejemplo, podemos ver que ha detectado pues Jordi, que es el nombre del presentador.
In this case, Jordi, for example, or on the door it says 100% electric. And we can check in which second this appears, and there are more data that we could see. And as I was saying earlier, so this is the code in this frame. It's very dark, but this is the laptop screen, and we can see the word thread. So here the power is quite interesting. And last, the last video is also quite relevant. And this is yet another video from another part of the former fuller 6-minute video from the Jihadist channel. And here we're going to look for Urban Guard, which is the police of the city of Barcelona. Justice will be established.
Estos fragmentos de vídeo son vídeos que realmente...
So these fragments are from videos that have been published in jihadist channels mentioning all the time Spain. That's why it's interesting to monitor them and to use these kind of tools to be proactive when it comes to detecting this content. Even though I'm repeating myself, but by watching the video, we wouldn't identify this, but by doing tests yesterday, we were assessing videos, and we could see some attacks. And one of the firefighters in the video, firefighters have a label, a belt label with their name and ID, and that could be a detail that you barely see. The guy is moving, the label is tiny, but the application detects it. You can tell that that person with that ID was there at that time. And here we're looking for Urban Guard. And if you see this, you can't really see it well, but we have the Desigual clothes brand that we're looking for. But we're looking for the video. It may be the brand of a TV ad, maybe someone was talking bad about the brand, or maybe they were modifying the video and they had a negative message. But see, these are the things that we can actually detect. But beyond that, and to finish, Carlos, have you noticed in the video who appears there at the beginning of the video? Relevant people, the King of Spain, the former Spanish president, Mariano Rajoy, Carlos Puigdemont, the former president of the Catalonian regional government, and we can actually identify who appears in these videos with facial recognition. So we can do something as powerful as the following. Look for the word Philip VI, the name of the king, and we can see whether this is detected. Let's say that we're doing surveillance, or monitoring someone, or watching videos, and we're interested in seeing something in particular. In this case, we didn't just acknowledge that or recognize that because we saw the word Felipe or King of Spain, but because there was facial recognition of all people here, and one of them is the King of Spain. So this is an example of the power we can get by applying these techniques, avoiding having to visualize a lot of content, because it would be unfeasible to send all the content published on social media. And here, as we were saying, the word doesn't appear, but we have the picture of the person interesting for the investigation.
carga bien.
Bueno, pues como veis, las posibilidades que tiene esto pues son inmensas, ¿no?
Voy a ir un
We
poquito
have
más.
seen the possibilities of these, which are quite big. I'm going to speed up because we're getting out of time. So why do we need social media analysis for? Mainly to discover patterns. Since we have a structure of hundreds of thousands of individuals or entities, as we'll see next. Why is this interesting? Well, to identify the most important stakeholders and to get the features of that kind of network and to know how we need to interact with it, and to get to know each role and each individual within the network, and to detect groups and subgroups within the actual network. And how is this done? Well, the basis is very powerful, mathematically speaking. We're not going to explain this, but briefly, we're interested in any network made up by nodes. The nodes is the smallest entity of a network. And here, by looking at the node, the main node will be here in red. Each node, an accessory, would be connected by lines or edges, which would be the connection system. And each node has a degree or grade. That is the number of nodes with which it is connected. And why is this interesting? When we talk about a node, we don't care about the type of entity it is. It could be a person, an IP address, a domain, a computer, and thereon, any sort of information that we want to associate with is interesting. Okay, let's look at an example. For this to be more real. So we have more demos prepared, but hopefully we'll be able to visualize them. Well, initially it should be okay. Let's see. Well, ideally, here could be any of us, and any sort of entity may have any sort of information, work, a friend, a vehicle, a spouse, and availing of these kind of information, we'll see what we can do. Let's see whether we can come back. Thank God we didn't bring more laptops, Carlos. Let's see whether it works now.
Es que se me activa esto. Vale. Nos lleva a esto. Perdonad. Al final lo que somos es...
So we get to this actually. If we imagine that each of these is us with our phone relationships, we get an example of the massive volume of information that we let out on the network that could be available of. For example, on Facebook, if you make an example between 2 million users, or amongst 2 million users, you get 2 random users. Amongst them, there will only be 4 leaps of people. And what happens here? All these data and information that we're publishing are not just used by companies, they're also used by the good guys and the bad guys. How? With influence operations. What is that? To change the behavior of a target audience, to alter their behavior. An example of this may be seen in the latest American elections, after an influence and a strong campaign to influence certain groups and polarizing the behaviors depending on specific messages, they managed to turn around elections. And to give an example, once we have a network, on which node can we act? Well, it will depend on what we mentioned earlier, the target. Why? Because if I want to disable this network, I probably want to end up with the guy in the glasses, because I'm splitting the network right in the middle. If I want to have an influence on the network, I'll go to his lady who may have more of an influence on the element. So it's very important to know what we want to do. And this is an example of a part of an extraction of a Telegram community. And here we have resources and network analysis, and here we need to detect the main nodes. And here on, acting on these 7 nodes, we could disable this whole network that otherwise would be unfeasible. But this is not just by the good guys, also by the bad guys. And we're going to give you an example. And this is related to what we mentioned earlier. It's good to get to know the user profile when it comes to having an influence. It's good to know was their discourse as well as the contrary discourse. It may be interesting to foster a message or to try to change it, to send a message or a specific advertising. Let's say that we know that they have certain ideas, we could try to change them or to radicalize the message. Maybe we could foster it and to attract other people. Maybe those people may have an influential profile that will take others to that objective or to those ideas or that approach we're looking after. Or in the case of elections, to try to vote to a certain person. I'm just going to give you an example. Usually I use different software for data analysis, but here I used this one. It's an open source version in case you're interested. And here, directly from a file, we'll load a series of information. And after a small investigation carried out on the election candidates, we detected, as we said, a microgroup within this volume of messages. And now we're going to see how they're structured. So what we've done here was to load all the information. And we're going to fix this so we can view better. And here, in this case, can you see it well? Well, here we can see how from a database where we had a lot of information on 2G communications, we can detect how there were some profiles that initially seemed independent, but once assessed, we could see that it would be these profiles, actually these nodes that we see here, which are the main influence nodes, and how they're able, in this case through 10 or 12 profiles, to have an influence on elections. Or, I'll give an example. Once in this information, we decided to research them. And it so happened that we found this, a series of profiles who are managing these channels. We're talking about 15 profiles that were bots eventually, that were controlling 30,000 accounts. And hereafter we can see that these profiles have simple features to detect when we made the investigation. First of all, they had many users. 5,000, 2,000, some of them had less. They were all located somewhere in Turkey. You cannot see it here, but these are Turkish populations. They all had between 2 and 7 tweets, not more. They all used as URL either Google, Twitter or Facebook. And hereafter, we could monitor them and control them and also report them. By the way, there's another feature that is quite relevant, which is that they had all been created between December, January and February. And this can be obtained by assessing the information within a group. We have very little time, we just have about a minute left, but this software can detect communities within a larger group. And this is used to investigate the bad guys, but also terrorists. Let's look for another example. And what we're going to show here is analysis that was done on the WhatsApp groups where they were sharing content. Initially, these were channels that were independent. And whoever controls these bots could actually spread fake news. But let's take into account that these bots now have that sort of particularity, but tomorrow, in the future, whoever accepted them as real in their accounts, that profile could change. They could become nationalistic, extreme right, and people could retweet or like without really knowing what's going on. And we can see how these WhatsApp groups exist. And here we can zoom in, see how that group could be fully independent, and when you begin observing how they communicate, if you assess information, you get the option of knowing to which node do we need to go to disable and break the whole communication network of jihadist propaganda. So let's speed up now. Regarding all this information, all these nodes, we can also detect that kind of group. Here we found a publication from hackers and cyber terrorists of DICE, and a few days ago they announced a number of websites that had been hacked. One of them was Madrid Emprende for entrepreneurship in Madrid. And this is the current state of the website. And this is an example that we detected that we use to detect radical profiles on Facebook. The most interesting bit so far is what we have just mentioned. We have seen the virtual communities, static ones. Okay, we see a graph, what it's like, and an interesting element is to see how they're created, formed, and how they evolve. So here, we're going to explain how each big header here is like a member of a social network, in this case Telegram. Each beam here is a publication of a content, and here on the left we can see the type of content they're sharing. And we can actually observe how little by little the networks are created. Each user shares, we can see the dates above, and little by little we can see how users are sharing things. And now we're going to see a real-time example.
Bien, vemos como se van.
Can you see it well? They're publishing content. Different nodes are being created. And at some point we want to go to a specific date, and we can see from that specific date how things are developed and spread, how content is spread. And to get a more visual demonstration, we got all the content, but I could make it specific to follow a profile, be it Twitter or Telegram in this case, to follow that profile so that visually we can sell or get more information that uses intelligence, because the graph technology or the network analysis may be useful to give knowledge and to have information, but on the other hand, they're also useful to sell to decision makers this information, which is very difficult to consume, but in this regard, it might be easier to make it understandable. We could not filter by content type, only by profile, so we're interested in seeing multimedia content. It's important not just to see the information sources, but also to have tools that allow us to treat and process that information in a way that allows us to be easily interpretable. Otherwise, we cannot generate data intelligence that we're looking for eventually to make decisions such as carrying out an operation or a certain movement. And well, this is the end of our presentation. We've done it really quickly. Basically, we wanted to mention all of this. We do apologize for going so quickly in the last part, but we did have some technical glitches. Thank you.